was a story set in a pre-developed world, did you scavenge in details from the Dinosaur Prince, or from some original other work that you probably from a plot that you discussed with your brother?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the elements and the world itself was developed out of our stories and games from when we were children growing up. And the Dinosaur Prince was, it had, the main character of this is called Rob Sardan. It was him as an adult who had this backstory that was only very vaguely alluded to. And one of the themes of the Dinosaur Prince was him trying to escape from his past. And yet the more I tried to have him escape from his past, the more I became intrigued by his past and wanted to explore it. And I would just throw out these odd phrases of things he had done. One of the phrases that, to this day, I don't know where it came from. I just randomly wrote one day, "He was the one who held the sea stone sword." I thought, that sounds cool. But the more I sort of kept mentioning it, it kept coming up as I was writing. I thought, I should write that story about what he did with the sea stone sword, because I thought it was interesting. No spoilers, I'm afraid. So I was still, determined to have the Dinosaur Prince published, because I thought it was worth publishing. Not so much that I thought it was worth publishing, I suppose. It was that having spent years and years writing and developing this world, I wanted it to mean something, perhaps. I wanted all that effort over all those years to have some kind of end to it, or have something come out of it. And I think that was why I was very, very determined to have this book published. So understandably, every time I approached an agent or a publisher, they just said, you're a new, unknown author who's never written anything before. We're not going to take a 200,000 word document about dinosaurs in a magical fantasy world. It's not going to work. So I went home very upset from that. But I had the thing that resonated with it was too long. So I decided I would write a shorter story. So this notion of Rob Sardan and the sea stone sword kept coming to my mind. So I decided I will write this character's story. I should point out, at this time, Rob Sardan was not a human. He was a bear. Because, like I say, this developed out as us telling stories about dinosaurs and bears and dragons and penguins. Yes, dragons and penguins. So as I was writing this, I decided I'm going to make Rob a human being, because apparently people can't relate to people who aren't human beings. But I think it worked better in the end, because I think it sometimes is a big ask to say to someone, okay, not only is this a magical world of dinosaurs, there are also anthropomorphic bears. So it felt like too much of an ask, especially, like I say, for a first novel. So after much hardship, I turned him into a human being, and it all went on from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned the penguins, and of course there is a race called the Pengs.
Yes.
In the novel. Any particular reason?
Well, we did have the penguins and the dragons were in the old stories were the rivals. The penguins didn't like the dragons, and the dragons didn't like the penguins, and they had this long history of conflict. That's it was one of those things that we developed it, and it started out as this just absurd thing. Tiny little penguins, giant dragons, fire-breathing dragons. It's no contest, surely. And yet we set up that, no, this is an ongoing conflict that has gone on for generations. At which point I had to work out, okay, why has it gone on for generations? Why haven't the dragons just wiped them out? It's this thing of take a very, very ridiculous concept and just treat it with absolute deadly seriousness. It tends to be my general method of developing things. Take the most ridiculous concept and make it serious. It was a challenge. The Pengs they're still very penguinish. They still have beaks and feathers, and they're still very short. But they're a bit more of a understandable world power, and they have an empire, which again is partly a joke because they have the Emperor Peng. So this will be a recurring theme, that a lot of decisions were based on jokes. So yeah, the Pengs slowly became one of my favourite aspects of the mythology, because ice and snow and cold, there's a lot of imagery there to work with, and once you start having a culture that's sort of based on frozen imagery and snowflakes that can be used very symbolically, that became very enjoyable. So I started out just developing this whole race of penguins who were very, very intelligent, very, very military minded, and their method for dealing with dragons was to just overwhelm them with numbers. So you get a sense of this. The penguins feature lightly within the Sea Stone Sword. They're very much a world power, but very much at the moment in the background as the series goes on. We'll meet them and get to know them a bit more on their history with the Drakes, as they're called now. Because we thought, everyone's got dragons, I've got Drakes, because they speak Welsh. Which, if a dragon was going to speak, it would speak Welsh. I think we can agree. So yeah, the dragons, the Drakes, they became a much more complicated and interesting race. I decided that there was this war that had happened between the penguins and the Drakes, and that this had happened generations ago, yet there was still a lot of tension. And as a result, the penguins had taken a very different route, that they wanted to expand their empire, while the Drakes wanted to become pacifists and had just neglected war and consider even the use of wings and their fire breath to be almost taboo and unheard of. Like, oh, you can't do that, how dare you? So they've got this very high and noble opinion of themselves. I think a lot of that came out of the elves to an extent. Because that was something in Tolkien that always intrigued me, was that the elves weren't just this... You get the impression that from The Hobbit initially, that especially the high elves are this noble and higher than thou race. But again, as you go into the Silmarillion, you find a lot of strife and a lot of darkness within the elves. You get the story of Fëanor and his sons and all the strife that comes from the oath, and you get the impression of the elves less of a almost fairy in the sort of fairy tale of modern day connotations, rather than fairies of what Tolkien would have known, because if you've read Tolkien's own fairy stories and all of his lectures on fairies and fairy stories, you get the impression that fairies themselves are this not just magical and enchanting, but dangerous and foreboding, and have there's this sense about them that you don't want to mess with them. They have their own rules, they have their own culture, their own sense of right and wrong. So as a result, when you're developing your own world and your own cultures within the world, I think it's good to have that in your mind, that you can't have a race that's completely this beacon of goodness, because it's not as interesting. And Tolkien's world is very much like that. That as much as people criticise Tolkien these days, oh, it was just good versus evil, it really wasn't. It really wasn't. I mean, the number of times I was listening to the audiobook of the Silmarillion, and the number of times Tolkien reiterates, they might have had victory if they hadn't messed it up, if they hadn't been squabbling with each other. And often understandably, because the Sons of Fëanor did some really terrible things. I've got a bit off topic, I realise, at this point.
Absolutely okay.
But yeah, again, there's a sort of fire and ice contrast between the Pengs and the Drakes. I think that was the initial idea behind why they were in conflict, because they seemed opposites.